Welcome back to the Wargrove of Well, and in today's video we're going to be doing a tier list of all of the Ossiarch Bonereapers units. Ossiarch Bonereapers is an army I personally collect, and they have a wonderful aesthetic. Most of their units are fairly powerful if you kind of interconnect all of their buffs and synergies that they have between each other. But in the grand scheme of things, because their book breaks a lot of the core rules of Age of Sigmar, I would be cautious if you are looking at Ossiarch Bonereapers as your first army. And just be aware that they are in a little bit of a precarious situation in terms of their power. They're kind of weak, but that is mostly because they just don't work well with Age of Sigmar 3.0 and all of the powerful tools that other factions have access to. But without further ado, let's get started. Before we get started, in this tier list, I'll be covering all of the units you see on screen. I will not be covering the Warhammer Underworlds units or any of the endless spells. I will mostly be covering the core units, so to speak. In the bottom tier, tier 4, we only have two units. We have the Mortizon Soulmason. So unfortunately, the Soulmason, although he is a beautiful model with a lot of really cool bits, he doesn't really provide anything that fits well with the Ossiarch Bonereapers. He's a weak combat wizard, and Ossiarch Bonereapers, their whole shtick is combining buffs to kind of make their units just that much better. And the Mortizon Soulmason doesn't do any of that. His whole thing is he does a little bit of damage with magic and in melee. And combine that with the kind of conflict with what the book wants to do, the Mortizon Soulmason fairly bottom tier. I never really bring him. I just don't see any value in him. Next up is Volcemorian, Master of the Bone Tithe. Besides having a really dope model, he is a really odd piece. He's mostly a niche debuff wizard, and he has a powerful spell, but the spell is almost impossible to get off. If you are unaware, what a spell does is a model within 1 inch of him, if you cast the spell and the spell goes off, that model is dead. So useful against very powerful wizards, or not wizards, excuse me, very powerful heroes or big centerpiece units. But it goes off on an 8, and Volcemorian does not have any innate spellcasting buffs, and you have to get there. You have to get into close combat with him for that to happen. He has some tools that allow him to try and get into close combat. Like, he can pick a unit within a certain range, and on a 5-up they cannot attack or damage Volcemorian, but that's on a 5-up, so it's not reliable at all. So, really cool unit, not very useful. Next up in tier 3, these are some units that you could probably find niche use from. First up, we have the Martech Crawler. This unit is very, very cool looking, and it has some really powerful attacks, but the downfall of it is it has no rend anywhere. And in Age of Sigmar 3.0, rend is key. So without any rend, your opponent can just Mystic Shield all defense and save it so that your attack doesn't do anything. The once per game ammo types that the Martech Crawler has access to are cool, but they're kind of weird to use. They kind of go off of either bravery or health, and they scale oddly with the damage chart that the Martech Crawler has. It's just a really odd ammos. They have a powerful effect of just slaying a model, so they're best targeted against something that has high value, but still just a little weird. Next up is the Immortus Guard. These guys are a bodyguard unit. That is their main purpose. They are useful in certain scenarios to keep a important hero alive, but other than that, I think they're fairly weak. And in my humble opinion, I think the Immortus Guard are just outshined by the Necropolis Stalkers. The Immortus Guard definitely have a purpose and a niche, so feel free to bring them if you want to protect your heroes a bit more. But I would rather just take some more Necropolis Stalkers. Next up is the Morghast Archive. They are a defensive hammer unit, and the thing with them is they're not bad, but they're not good. Like, they're a little bit expensive, and they have a little bit more defensive capabilities than the other Morghast unit, but it's just kind of like I would rather have an offensive hammer unit than a defensive hammer unit, if you understand what that means. They're good. You can equip them with either halberds or spirit swords. The only difference between the two is the halberds have less attacks but more damage, and the spirit swords have more attacks but less damage. So it's personal preference which weapon you want to give them. Next up is the mighty Nagash, how the mighty have fallen. Before the most recent OBR FAQ, I would say Nagash was tier 1, almost auto include. But the most recent FAQ has just broken Nagash. He just doesn't work. And he is too expensive for what he does. He's kind of back to being the great Shelfomancer. He's powerful on his base stats alone, but his cost prevents him from being useful in any meaningful capacity, at least in OBR. I've heard that Nagash is doing fairly well in some of the other death armies, but I would not take Nagash in OBR personally, but he's a cool model. Before we move on to tier 2 and above, I'd like to give a special thanks to our Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome. A special thanks to Nick Hoff. Thank you very much for supporting the channel. If you would like to become a Patreon supporter, there will be a link in the description below, as well as a link to the Discord, so you can come and hang out and join the community. In tier 2 are the Morghast Harbingers. Now, these are my preferred Morghast units. They are an offensive hammer unit. So, whereas the Archai have a better ward save, the Morghast Harbingers have a better charge. They roll 3d6 instead of 2d6 when they're charging, giving them a surprising degree of mobility and allowing them to get into combat more easily. I really like Harbingers. And I think that having a unit is always useful to have a really nice hammer unit, but they kind of fulfill a similar niche to the Necropolis Stalkers. Next up is the Necropolis Stalkers. I absolutely adore this unit. It is a very flexible hammer unit. Their kind of four-headed stance ability that they have allows them to really fine-tune what buffs they want for a specific combat. If you want to do damage, if you want to just ensure that you're going to get some damage in, or whatever you need, the Necropolis Stalkers can probably do it. They are really, really scary and a definite useful offensive tool that OBR kind of needs. Ironically, the leader unit, the falchions, those big swords that you see the guy in the front wielding, I think they're a little bit weaker than the four swords that the two in the back have. But that's a kind of, you can talk about that all day, but that's just something else I'd like to know about them. Next up is the Mortizon Soulmason. Besides having a really, really cool model, I love his hat, love his chair. He is a great offensive buff wizard. His whole thing is he has a good spell that allows you to reroll hit rolls, and you can potentially cast it many, many times over, getting it on a lot of your units. So really, really good. I think he's a little bit more optional than some of the other units, but definitely a powerful unit if you want some more offensive capabilities. Next is the Liege Kaplos. This guy is a wonderful model. He is an offensive buff hero as well as a good combat specialist. He's fast on his mount, he has some good combat, he buffs a lot of different units, and he has a general buff that just gives +1 attack. Very powerful. I almost always have a Liege Kaplos. I really like him being near my Martech Guard to let them hit back a little harder than they otherwise would. And he also, in at least my lists, is a good candidate to be my general. He makes use of a lot of the artifacts very well, and a lot of the general traits also he works very well with. So overall, I really enjoy the Liege Kaplos. Next up is the named Liege Kaplos, the Archcavaliers Heszantos. So I think these two are fairly interchangeable. Xantos has a similar usefulness to the Liege Kaplos. He has a little bit more niche targeted buffs, and if you want to maximize his power, he forces you into the Mortis Praetorian subfaction, which isn't the most powerful subfaction. Its power comes from the named characters that you get access to, Xantos and Catacross. Last in tier 2 is the Cavaliers Death Riders. Now, on base, on paper, they are not the best cavalry unit, but because they are an OBR, they get to be in tier 2. Because they are a battle line unit, the second of 2 battle line units, and because of their speed. OBR is fairly slow, and having access to a speedy cavalry unit is very useful to have. They are an okay skirmish unit, and they are good for tagging annoying enemy units to prevent them from targeting something important with either combat or ranged abilities. Next up in tier 1, we have the Martech Guard. This is your bread and butter unit for OBR. Martech Guard are, I would consider, one of the best units in OBR, if not the best unit in OBR. You are always going to want to have a lot of Martech Guard. They are fantastically defensive, and they will hold the line more or less forever. The only problem that Martech face is they are a little bit weak against rend and mortal wounds. So before I move on, I'd like to kind of give you an example of how defensive Martech Guard can be. If your opponent has like 1 or 2 rend, your Martech can be at a 3 or 4 up re-rolling save with a potential 5 up ward save, and then a 4 up after save from a Galthazar Harvester. So you have 3 different rolls, one with a re-roll, to prevent damage. Woof, that's a really powerful unit. Next up is Arkhan the Black. I love Arkhan. He is a fantastic magic support unit. He knows all of the spells of the Ossiarch Bonereapers lore, which gives him very versatile uses, and he is very useful to keep multiple units topped off, allowing him to kind of sit in the center of your formation and just cast spells and keep your Martech alive. I would be cautious with Arkhan though, because he is not the best melee unit. If you send him in, be prepared to be disappointed. I generally like to keep him safely hidden away so you can just cast spells. He is a little bit squishy compared to a lot of the other Mortarchs, so just keep that in mind. Next up is Catacross, the Mortarch of the Necropolis. Now, if Arkhan was the critical magic support unit, Catacross is the critical martial support unit. He has some fantastic buffs and debuffs in his kit, and he's great. He does force you into Mortis Praetorians, and because of this, he can work well with Archcavaliers Xantos if you want to go that route. I think that, generally speaking, you should either have Arkhan or Catacross. Taking both might be a little bit pricey on the points side, but there's nothing against it. I think that choosing one or the other is generally a better option, and specializing a little bit more, but definitely a very powerful unit to consider. Next up is the Galthazar Harvester. Now this one might be a little bit of a controversial pick. Some people think that it should be a tier or 2 lower just because of how easy it is to get rid of sometimes. But I still just stand by this thing as it is a tier 1 auto-include unit. You at least want 1, maybe 2. The Galthazar Harvester is really what pushes your Martech defensive capabilities over the edge. It is what allows you to keep your units alive so well. If you aren't aware, the Galthazar Harvester's ability is whenever a model, friendly or enemy, dies within 3 inches of it, you can roll a dice based on how many wounds the model had. And the higher wound models, you get to heal or resurrect a certain number of friendly OBR units nearby. Very, very powerful. It is kind of squishy if you focus it down, but it is super good. Also, it's a monster, so it gives you access to some monstrous actions as well as bonus points for other battle tactics and the likes. It has two weapons, the punchy fists or the slashy fists, that's like a bludgeon or scythes. All it does is it kind of makes the harvester either better at fighting infantry or potential to do some mortal wounds, a little bit better against armor. I personally like the punchy fists, the bludgeons a bit more, but they both work. It's just a personal preference choice. Last but not least is the Mortizon Boneshaper. This guy is simple and effective. He's a magical support unit, and his whole thing is he really helps keep your units topped up. Getting access to this is just always useful, and having another wizard is good. He's cheap enough that you can consider bringing two if you really wanted to. I always at least have one, so definitely a great unit to have. So that was all of the Ossiarch Bonereapers units. If you liked this video, please leave a like or a comment, and if you enjoy my type of content, consider subscribing. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about this tier list in the comments below. OBR is kind of a weaker faction, and so their units can kind of shift around a little bit in the tier list, so please let me know. Well, without further ado, this has been the Worker of Woe. I'll see you guys next time.